Gesine, thank you very much for being a guest again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here again.
So, I feel like one of the many terrible things about Trump is that you live through about 10 historical epochs in the space of a month. And it's been about 5 months since we last spoke. I thought I'd begin by asking, are you as exhausted keeping up with all the news as I am?
I think so, yes. It's certainly your advantage as an analyst, scholar, expert on that is that you certainly don't get bored. And if you like having an intense rhythm, Donald Trump ensures that you're getting that. But yes, admittedly, it's a lot to follow. But the biggest challenge, I would say, from an expert perspective, is the big uncertainty that comes with it. Even more so as there is, as we're recording, still no national defense strategy, and we try to make sense of what we have seen to anticipate what might be coming. But there's just no way to predict what we can expect. And that makes it even more challenging, despite, of course, as you mentioned, the density of events.
So, back in May, we discussed the need for Europeans to think strategically again with Ukraine, with China, with Trump's return. It sort of heightened the importance for Britain and Europe to push back on Russian aggression and lessen their dependence on Beijing and Washington. And what I thought we could do today is try and divine from all the news if they're succeeding. So, what I thought I'd start with is something we talked about in May was immediately after Trump became president again, his administration sort of went hard on Europe. There was this quite simplistic idea driven by the likes of sort of Elbridge Colby that Europe was done and America needed to abandon it in order to focus on China, which provoked a bit of a freak out across the continent, and all this idea of, America's leaving, Europe's on its own, Russia's going to roll into Estonia and Poland and Germany any day now. And when we spoke in May, that view had sort of softened, and European leaders seemed to have less of a sense of urgency than they did in sort of February. Where do you think Europe is now?
Yeah, I would agree to a certain extent and say that the big freak out moment is over. So especially the NATO summit in The Hague this summer has been a massively reassuring moment for many European states. And that is also something that is visible in the actually very short summit declaration. But this summit declaration, which is always agreed on by all participating states, meaning including the United States, clearly emphasizes a commitment to Article 5, so the mutual defense clause, and also really emphasizes that Russia is a long-term threat to the alliance. And especially for Eastern European states, that was a massive reassurance. On the other side, European states have, of course, also made significant commitments. So the willingness to step up defense spending to 3.5%, plus defense adjacent spending to an additional 1.5%. So in total, 5% commitments that are made is a big commitment. Although I also think it is too simplistic to say this is only a Trump effect, because there is still a war on the European continent. But yes, indeed, all this has contributed to a certain reassurance. But on the other side, we also see that certain patterns become visible with the new Trump administration. And one of these patterns is open coercion against allies. Yes, the tone coming out of Washington has softened. We have not heard a second J.D. Vance speech as we had it at the Munich Security Conference, which really also attacked the European societal model as open liberal societies. And this has not been the case again. But there is the trade deal, or one could also say basically a codification of the trade war between the United States and the EU, where the EU accepts US or tariffs on EU goods. And we see that there was a lot of pressure on Europeans to accept that. And the lesson here for the Trump administration is obviously coercion works and pressure works. And the Europeans, you just have to go hard on them, and in the end, they will agree. So yes, the freak out moment is over, but Europeans also see that in the end, this dependence on the United States today is still so significant, whether it comes to security especially, but also to Russia's war on Ukraine and all the ramifications of that, and also to economy, that they just don't abandon this bond and rather do things they might not want to do originally than threaten the relationship with Trump.
As you touched on, there's a big problem for Europeans, and I guess most of the world, is the unpredictability. J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, was he was talking about Trump sending the National Guard to Chicago, and he said, "This is a man who's suffering dementia. This is a man who has something stuck in his head. He doesn't read. He doesn't know anything that's up to date. It's just something in the recess of his brain." Whether Trump has dementia or not, I felt like it's a good description of how his brain works, in that there will be some idea along there that will just come out of nowhere. And so I feel like European leaders have made a lot of progress in enticing him away from Putin, encouraging this idea that Putin's a bad faith actor, that he should recommit to European defense. Everything seems to go well. And then out of nowhere, Russia hoax, Hunter Biden, tariffs will just come out of nowhere and just undo all that diplomatic work.
Yeah, in fact, this question, how does Trump's brain work? I think this is the $100 billion question. And I think if I had the answer to that, I might be sitting in a very different position, but unfortunately I don't. So I think what Europeans seem to understand is that it is very hard to convince Trump if he has a fixed idea. And if he seems to have made his mind up on a topic and has an opinion, and he wants especially, let's say, get a certain deal on a topic, that this is the way how you have to engage with him. So less on the question, how does his brain work? Where do his ideas come from? The question for Europeans is more, how can you engage with him in a way that he will also engage with you? And a promising way seems really this idea of making deals and also helping Trump or supporting Trump in getting the deals he wants. Because that is ultimately, I think, how Europeans could successfully engage with him over Ukraine and Russia. Because ultimately what Trump wants is a deal. And he wants a deal that is sustainable and a deal that doesn't blow off after a week or so. And the big card that Europeans can play in this context is, Mr. President, we want you to succeed with this deal. We are on your side. And we are your co-deal makers. So let's see how we can make this deal together. And I think that Europeans are getting better in these strategies where they, on the one hand, defend their interests and define their strategies of negotiations and of Trump flattery in a certain way, that they ultimately serve European interests. But of course, this is a super narrow path because on the one hand, there are European interests, and on the other hand, they know that a certain degree of flattery seems to be necessary to engage with Trump. So the key question is, how far can you go, and what are basically your red lines on European interests to still get Trump's endorsement for your ideas without making it look Trump is endorsing it, but making it look in a way that he's actually winning the engagement and getting what he wants from a deal.
We sort of saw this with Ukraine and the EU trade deal of, on the one hand, an immediate strategic challenge for Europe is Ukraine making sure Russia is seen to be defeated and an end to the war in such a way that Europe is more secure medium to long term. And then the other strategic challenge is lessening dependence on America so that in future if there is another erratic, unpredictable American administration, Europe doesn't have to do the same flattery and sort of everything like that. And I guess the challenge for European leaders is like, how do you make deals that don't worsen your dependence on America? The criticism of the trade deal was that it was doing it for the sake of Ukraine, but then worsening the EU's position via America.
Yeah, totally. I would say that in general, this idea of strengthening European security and defense, it's not only about this idea of having to do flattery again with another president who might be similarly unpredictable. I think it is really also about the broader perspective of US grand strategy, which at least at the moment seems to be tilting a bit more towards the Indo-Pacific in a more selective engagement posture. I think it is safe to say that the United States, regardless of who's the president, at least on a medium term, will not be focused on Europe. And on the other hand, when we're looking at things that are happening around Europe, and especially in the East, there are many good reasons for Europeans to be concerned about their security and defense. So I would say this idea of a more independent European defense and a bigger European capacity to act should also be an intrinsic motivation of Europeans, and not only the extrinsic motivation and the external factor of Trump or whoever is coming. So this idea to be able to defend yourself and not to depend on the strategy of an external power for your own continent, I think that sounds actually quite reasonable. And maybe that is also the perspective of someone who is born after the Cold War and has, basically always grown up in Europe. So for me, it is a no-brainer that Europe should want this capacity to defend itself, regardless of how US grand strategy looks like. And then, of course, it also is, at least at the moment, as you say, it's a very fine line to walk, because on the one hand, Europeans now really have to make more efforts convincing the United States that it stays engaged in Europe. And on the other hand, the big question for Europeans are, where are your pain points and where are the red lines? What are the interests that definitely need to be defended, and where can we also make concessions or accept trade-offs and all that? And it's here where it gets challenging, because ultimately, especially in light of the threat that Russia constitutes for Europe today, the all and overarching interest of Europeans is security. And the US just has the best tool here to protect Europeans, which is its security guarantee through NATO. And that also gives the US the finest tool of coercion one could ever imagine. And that's the significant challenge for Europeans to navigate here, that in the end, when it comes to European security, and the US just plays with the idea, or openly alludes to the idea, to potentially give up this security guarantee, which is, by the way, something we haven't seen anymore in the last months, but which could theoretically happen very easily. Then the question for Europeans is, shouldn't we accept that our economies are not going well if the US asks for a tremendous economic price? If that means that we still have a nuclear umbrella to protect or to deter Russia? Like, it's a very, very fine line to walk. And I don't think that Europeans have defined these red lines and pain points.
I mean, something that frustrates me about the whole Elbridge-Colby school, and also Obama's pivot, is that historically, actually, America has to be interested in both Europe and Asia. Like, it has to do both. So that's why I find Trump's engagement with NATO especially frustrating, because neither he nor, I feel, the Obama administration really got the allies accentuate American power. They don't weaken American power. And that it's precisely having this coercion method of Article 5 that you can get all these states to do what America wants.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it really depends on your personal understanding of what alliances are in international relations. And then, to a certain extent, it depends on what your personal preferred grand strategy is. So the idea that you just laid out, the idea that allies amplify US power and are basically key cooperation partners also to defend US interests in the world, is an idea that is closely linked to the grand strategy of deep engagement, where you assume that in very simple terms, extensive engagement and investment in your alliances pays off because your allies will support your resolutions at the UN. They will support you diplomatically. They will potentially also support you militarily. And they will really aim to cooperate with you and support your objectives. So that is a bit more simplistic idea of deep engagement. And then, for example, with that also comes a commitment. Like, you want your allies to support you. That also means that you commit to protecting your allies and that you assume that the security of your allies is absolutely vital because your allies are your power amplifiers. So that is one school how you can see alliances. On the other hand, if you're more someone like Average Colby, who is an so-called offshore balancer and who believes that you can support allies to amplify your power, but not necessarily need to support all your allies like the Europeans ones, especially if they're rich and can support you themselves, then you have a very different conceptualization of alliances. And if you go even further, you can also say, like, an increasing strand today are restrainers, and some of them basically say alliances can be helpful, but often they are actually a liability for the United States. And if there is no direct security benefit, as you would have it, for example, let's say, if you're the US and you have an alliance with Canada or with Mexico, which are direct neighbors, like, why should the US have an alliance with a partner that is very far away from you and where you don't have a direct benefit from that? I don't say that I believe in either of these schools, but that is a bit how you can look at alliances from a conceptual perspective. And dependent on the conceptual perspective that you have on alliances, you will adapt your strategy towards alliances. So this idea that you have to be engaged in Europe and fully engaged in Europe and fully commit to the security of your allies, because in the end they might also support what you are doing in the Indo-Pacific or whatever other foreign policy objectives the United States have, is an idea that deeply relies on the idea of deep engagement. Whereas the idea that Europeans can basically manage European security on their own and that US engagement should be much more selective. I don't say that it should, in that case, that it would be totally ending, but restrainers basically say Europeans are rich, they can take care of their own defense. We can support, but European security is a real European responsibility. So then your strategy looks very different. So in the end, how you understand this engagement with allies across theaters ultimately depends on your very own beliefs on how international relations function.
Something else that frustrates me is sort of Americans have been having this argument for 250 years, and it's like, just pick one, just so we can plan around it, because these arguments have been going on since Washington or in sort of the late 19th century or the 1920s. And it's like, there's nothing new about this argument in America, but it would be nice if you just resolved it.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that is the big black box that Europeans are facing every 4 years, because in the end, US grand strategy depends a lot on a person in the White House. And it can totally happen that things go a bit against what is originally planned in strategy, because it's always hard to predict world politics. And I think that is a bit what we are seeing at the moment, also under the Trump administration or second Trump administration, where in general the idea was to be more selective abroad. And I mean, Trump's campaigns were always no new wars and all that. Then somehow you see US airstrikes on Iran earlier this year. So now we see the US actually being pulled in the Middle Eastern theater much more than it was probably what the what the Trump administration hoped for. And sometimes even a certain doctrine doesn't really help you when you feel that other interests are at stake. But yeah, from an ally perspective, it would be great if we had kind of a a playbook that was handed over to Europeans in the beginning of an administration. So I think that is also why Europeans are so eagerly looking forward to the national defense strategy, because it can provide at least some ideas of the prevailing ideas and strategic thinking. So you can put it a bit in one box and don't get the total surprise.
On this question of sort of like balancing America's wants or Trump's wants now versus sort of long-term European benefits. When I interviewed the economist Christina Kafara a few months ago, and we were talking about Eurostack and freeing Europe from dependence on sort of American tech, she argued that the most important tool in that Europeans had control over was procurement. I guess I would say that it seems like the EU and European leaders are appreciating that when it comes to defense, because I think the German Chancellor Merz was talking about, I think it was at least 70% of Germany's increased defense spending going on European arms manufacturers as a key way to sort of lessen dependence on America and American weapon systems.
Yes, indeed. And I think that we are now at a time where Europe slowly but steadily realizes that its economic power is its biggest asset, and that it has to use that more strategically. Many in this regard refer to a geo-economic turn of the EU, which we see on the one hand with its massive sanctions on Russia, of course, but also in general with the fact that it now uses its economic tools much more actively. For example, in its international relations with countries outside Europe through, let's say, the Global Gateway, because Europe realizes that this is actually a significant asset when you're dealing with countries or with potential partner countries, because they are seeking, let's say, certain investments and so on, or certain clean tech. And it is here where Europe can actually really weigh in and make some progress. And for the defense industry, there is, of course, a huge problem of fragmentation in Europe. But on the other hand, again, the European Union actually has quite a lot of tools already in its toolkit that it can use to support and actually create this European defense industrial base much more. So in this regard, for example, it's a fantastic decision of the German government to say only 8% of the new spending will go to the United States, and most of it will stay in Europe, because Germany is just the economic powerhouse of the EU, and having one of the major member states making so significant investments in Europe is a very strong political signal as well.
Sort of on the bigger systemic things, I was also struck by the speech that President Macron gave last week, I think, about European dependence on American and Chinese social media networks, which either consciously or unconsciously are encouraging sort of anti-democratic forces across the continent. But again, I was struck at this, that there seems to be an appreciation of the long-term systemic challenges to Europe and the EU, which weren't necessarily there a few years ago.
Yeah, the strategic rivalries as such are really something that Europe is becoming more and more aware of. And I would say it is, on one hand, the strategic rivalry between the United States and China, where Europe, of course, and that is also something we see in the speeches of French President Macron, but also, for example, in the speeches of von der Leyen, really wants to avoid becoming leverage for any side. But on the other hand, again, the unpredictability of the Trump administration doesn't make it easier at the moment for Europe, because we still don't know how this competition will actually unfold. So is the Trump administration going all in for competition, including a potential risk of confrontation? Is Trump going to seek any deal and will be happy with that? Or will the United States actually say, maybe we have exaggerated this threat from China and maybe we can scale back? All this would significantly impact what Europe can do or what it can't do. So that is a big question at the moment. But also more generally, the EU and Europe are pretty much aware that there are two superpowers around that have a lot of leverage on Europe. And we have seen, be it with the COVID-19 pandemic or with trade in general, or now also with the linkage of security and trade, that there is a significant risk of weaponization. So basically using strategic assets in a way to exercise coercion on Europe. And I think the key challenge here for Europe is really to think, how can you deal with the two superpowers? Because you will have to deal with the United States and China. And decoupling from none of the two sides will work because the dependencies are just too significant. But how can you deal with them and ensure that you're not vulnerable?
I was really struck by something you wrote recently, which has been interesting me a lot. The title of the post was "Crink is Cringe," and Crink being China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And there's this general argument that is kind of advanced by lots of different people across the political spectrum. Biden would talk about it. Trump people may talk about it. But an idea of a sort of an axis of authoritarianism, which is challenging the West. And so the West needs to collectively challenge Russia and China and North Korea. And I was really interested in what you wrote, because I feel like this axis of authoritarianism downplays the divisions within that axis, and also the potential to widen gaps in that axis on specific issues. So whether it's China and Ukraine, or the historic rivalry between Russia and China, they're all things that haven't gone away, and the West or Europeans can actually leverage.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I would still stand to that point that I find the Crink framing extremely cringe, especially from a European perspective, because first it relies on a very American conceptualization of who are your adversaries and who are your friends. And this entire definition of the axis of upheaval, as Kendall Taylor and Fountain called it in their Foreign Affairs article, is based on this idea that these are four powers that challenge US interests and that threaten US interests, and that are hence adversaries for the United States. And for me, it's extremely problematic to use this framing from a European perspective, because I think it is way too simplistic. It is a bit like China is Russia, is Iran, is North Korea, and all of them is evil. So let's put them in an axis of upheaval, and that simplifies our life when we're thinking about these partners. But for me, it is way too simplistic, especially when you're looking, for example, at European relations with China, which are extremely complicated. I mean, there are certainly elements of rivalry, but there are also certainly elements of partnership where Europe and China need to need to work together. And I think that this concept of the axis of upheaval is way too simplistic in this regard. As you say, I also think that the concept doesn't sufficiently capture all the divisions within the axis, and also how dynamic or the respective bilateral relationships in these among these four powers actually are. And in general, I would say that this entire framing is very much focused on an idea that the world can be divided in basically democracies and autocracies. And these four are the four worst, and they are challenging global order. And this entire idea is kind of constructed on the idea that global order is constructed on democracy or autocracy. And for me, the concept ignores structural factors too much on several levels. So on the one hand, for example, the fact that China is so much more powerful than Russia or Iran or North Korea, and that this significantly impacts how these powers stand to each other within this. I don't even want to say bloc, but some people put it as a bloc. And on the other hand, it doesn't really see that China has a totally different agency than the others in the international system. So for me, just putting them into a bloc and assuming that they all want the same and do the same, just because the US sees them as adversaries, for me is problematic. And from a European perspective, it's even more problematic, because if we as Europeans use that, we use the US framing, which is not even based on European interests, but blindly or basically adopts what the US is saying to define our strategy and strategic reading on that. And that, to use the term of my article, I just find that cringe.
I mean, the other day I saw the former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yatsenuk basically saying that China's fully backing Russia in Ukraine, and Ukraine and the West need to be much more tough with China and appreciate that it's an adversary, just like Russia is. And something I've always found interesting since the start of the full-scale invasion is that Ukraine has always played a very subtle game with China of like, although Russia is heavily dependent on China to pursue the war, Ukraine has always taken its view into account. It's always engaged it in terms of any sort of peace deal or peace conference. It's never sort of outright criticized China. And then China has also put curbs on what Russia can do, like allegedly potentially using a tactical nuclear missile. So there's been this ambiguity in the Ukraine-China relationship, which interestingly, Zelensky started to change after the terrible Oval Office meeting, when he sort of called out Chinese troops fighting for Russia. But up until then, it was very much that ambiguous policy. And I've always thought, from China's perspective, like from a purely realist, cynical perspective, it's in China's interests for Russia to be focused west and for Russia to have on its border a large, militarily powerful country that is of Europe but isn't in Europe, that could counterbalance Russia if it ever chooses to look east. And so I feel things like that are hidden by the whole axis of authoritarianism, Russia and China as equal adversaries to the West as everyone else.
First disclaimer, I'm not an expert on Russia-China relations or their respective history, but I think that you're making a super important point more generally here. And that is precisely that point, that Russia-China relations are anything but easy. Like there is, of course, this friendship without limits that the two have committed to. But I think in practice that we see still quite a lot of limits. And I mean, if you want to put it very simplistically, yes, we're seeing a lot of reports on how China supports Russia. But up until today, China has never publicly endorsed that. And I think if we are simply putting the two of them in a box, we're making our lives too easy. And I also, as an analyst who's looking more at Europe, would be extremely interested to see more of these dynamics and also like Chinese reasoning on Russia's war against Ukraine. Unfortunately, none of that is public.
Because I mean, when Trump initially reached out to Russia and it seemed like America and Russia were going to do a deal on Ukraine that cut out Ukraine and cut out Europe, I did sort of wonder, why doesn't Europe just go to Beijing?
I mean, Brussels has tried to go to Beijing. Just a few weeks after the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022, there were meetings between highest EU level and Chinese counterparts. And I think it is very clear that Europeans are also stressing that in all the meetings. But the fact that China just doesn't move on this from a European perspective is immensely problematic. And China's position on the war has also significantly changed how Europe is reading China and how Europe is defining its relationships with China. That's also something that Commission President von der Leyen has said quite early on. China's position on this war is going to define how Europe sees China. And I think that is something that we see today because the tone in Brussels, besides the fact that there are still a lot of economic questions that need to be addressed, is becoming rougher and is more and more tending towards also seeing China as potentially a threat to European security. Precisely also because Europeans see China just not openly condemning this war, which for Europeans is a massive security threat.
Something else we talked about last time is sort of the every year seems to be the year that the EU realizes it's a grand strategic actor, or now is the moment for the EU to take hard power seriously. The other day, von der Leyen said that basically that Europe is in a hybrid war with Russia, with Russian incursions into European airspace, the crises with drones at Munich and in Denmark, and also the story in the FT about Russia making it difficult for von der Leyen's plane to land in Bulgaria a few months ago. And I'm sort of curious about, to say that we are in a hybrid war with Russia is quite a big thing. And to what extent is that going to, what actions are going to follow from that?
So I would maybe challenge you a bit on saying that it's a big thing to call the situation with Russia today a hybrid war, because I think that is something that we've seen going on for at least 5, 6, 7 years. Like when we see, like for example, the Skripal poisoning in the UK, when we see a murder in the German Tiergarten in Berlin. And when we see Russian open election interference in elections in EU member states and pushing narratives.
My point was more, we are in a hybrid war with Russia, but for von der Leyen to say it turns it into a thing that there's something needs to be explicitly done about it. So that was more my thing.
Yeah, I think for many in Europe, I think it was clear that it is a hybrid war, and also some European policymakers have said that before. So I would say it wasn't entirely new, although it of course hits a bit different when it comes from the EU Commission President. I think what was probably the bigger wake-up call than actually saying it was really kind of seeing these drones more and more over European territory. So I think the question is really now, how is this going to turn into action? But here again, there is the problem that the EU as a military actor is actually quite underdeveloped, and then responses to such situations are often responses that need to be made on the national level. So what the EU can do is, of course, doubling down on instruments like disinformation and election interference, and also see how it can support resilience measures in the member states. But ultimately here, it's the member states that need to act. And that makes it, on the one hand, potentially quicker and more efficient, because then you don't have the long decision procedures and can address the problem really where it physically is. But on the other hand, it also makes it difficult to get a common response and a coordinated and joint response.
Finally, sort of on that, something else we talked about in May was the sort of challenge between the sort of long-term grand strategic vision and sort of strategy, and then also the challenge for political leaders in the short term, a challenge that many European leaders have and von der Leyen has, is precisely Russia is interfering in European politics. It is supporting far-right parties. Those parties are also doing well electorally, which heightens this challenge that, say, someone like Macron has. And then it's like, which is going to win out first? The sort of the hard right and that undoing the work of people like Macron and von der Leyen, or will they win out in the end?
That's a good question. I mean, the reason why far right forces are winning, and I say that more from my perspective as an observer than an expert on far right parties, is often that they are fundamentally good in capitalizing on fears of people, and having simple answers to very complex questions. And I think what many European governments have lost in the last years, especially also in the years after COVID pandemic, but even earlier during the Euro crisis, is output legitimacy. So that many citizens feel left behind and the state is not delivering. And that is perfect ground for far-right or populist forces to say, hey, we have a much easier solution for you. But I think what is really essential is also to listen to the narrative of these parties and to understand why these narratives resonate. And in the end, it comes down to making or designing public policy in a way that is more appealing to citizens. So I would say in the end, what you really need to do, and of course it sounds much simpler than it actually is addressing the problems or the challenges for people in everyday life. And if you, by this, manage to build inclusive and strong societies and also potentially get to another economic impetus because you manage to include people and generate creativity and all that, then you also have, again, different resources for power that you can then use for your grand strategy.
Gesine, thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fantastic.